They thought I was too small to notice the storm they were stirring, but I've always heard thunder long before the rain. By the time they learned I wasn't deaf to their whispers, it was already too late. The day of Walter's funeral began with rain and ended with champagne. Savannah, Georgia, wears grief differently than most cities. The air clings to you here, heavy and damp, and every scent seems amplified after a summer storm. That afternoon, the magnolias by the front gate still held droplets like crystal beads, and the Spanish moss hung wet and low from the oaks, as if even the trees were bowing their heads. Inside our house, my house, the air was thick with perfume, cologne, and the faint metallic tang of too many people touching things that didn't belong to them. I came down the stairs slowly, my black dress still creased from sitting through the service. My hair pinned in the simple twist Walter always said made me look like trouble in church. The staircase was narrow, lined with framed photographs. Walter shaking hands with governors, cutting ribbons, holding grandkids who now barely made eye contact with me. At the bottom step, I stopped. The hallway was crowded. Melissa, Walter's daughter from his first marriage, stood with her back to me, holding her phone out as if she were photographing evidence at a crime scene. Her husband, Tom, trailed behind her with a roll of neon green sticky notes, slapping them onto furniture like he was marking garage sale items. "That leather armchair will look perfect in the lake house," Melissa said. Tom grinned, slapped a green note on the armrest. Mine. Across the hall, Walter's son Greg was standing in front of the antique grandfather clock Walter had inherited from his own father. "Too big for my place," Greg said to no one in particular. "But we could sell it. Antique dealers would pay a fortune." In the dining room, someone laughed. That high, brittle laugh people use when they want to sound casual about being cruel. "We'll knock this wall down," Melissa said. "Open it up. Spa room." Spa room. Walter had built that dining room with his own hands 35 years ago, long before I met him. He'd chosen the cherry wood table himself. That table had hosted Christmas dinners, birthday breakfasts, and the night I signed the check that kept his company alive. I stepped into the doorway. No one looked at me. A younger voice piped up from the kitchen. "This place smells like mothballs in history." "History's just old clutter," Melissa replied. They laughed. I moved into the dining room, my shoes clicking against the hardwood Walter had polished every spring. My chair at the head of the table was gone, replaced with a folding chair dragged in from the garage. One leg wobbled, no cushion. Melissa saw me looking. "You'll be more comfortable in the laundry nook," she said, smiling without her eyes. "Quieter there. Quieter." I found the nook, a space barely big enough for a mop bucket and a half-empty bottle of bleach. Someone had set a paper plate of cold chicken and potatoes on the counter beside an old moving blanket folded on top of a stool. That, apparently, was where I'd eat. From the other room, their voices carried easily. Dad always said she'd go before him. Guess he got that wrong. She built soup. He built an empire. Let her rot with her memories. They didn't bother to lower their voices. They didn't bother to check if I could hear. I pressed my palm against the front pocket of my cardigan. Inside was a folded bank memorandum, notarized and signed 15 years ago. My name was there in bold. Co-founder, not witness, not dependent, not recipient. Back when the company was drowning, Walter was too proud to ask for help. I sold everything my mother had left me. The sapphire necklace she wore at her wedding, the gold bangles she gave me on mine. The brooch Walter once said reminded him of the sea. I sold it all, wired the money to the company's escrow account, and asked Walter for just one thing, that no one ever know. He kept that promise. Melissa's teenage son wandered into the nook with his phone in one hand and a sticky note in the other. Without looking at me, he slapped it onto the walnut sideboard. "This one's mine," he said. The paper glowed orange against the dark wood. I looked at it and said nothing. I remember the night it all began. 15 years ago, Walter came home late, his tie undone, his hands trembling. "We're days from losing everything," he whispered. "Clients gone, contracts canceled." He needed collateral for a deal in New York, money he didn't have, pride that wouldn't let him ask. While he slept, I opened the velvet box in my dresser. Each piece had a story. My mother's voice in my ear as she fastened the necklace. Walter's face when he saw me wear the bangles for the first time. The brooch I wore to our engagement party. I didn't cry when I sold them. I didn't cry when I signed the bill of sale. I didn't cry when I wired the funds. I only cried later, when Walter kissed my cheek and said, "They called me a visionary." They never called me. From the laundry nook, I could hear Tom bragging about the lake house. "It's already under my name." Greg wanted Walter's vintage convertible. "She doesn't even drive," he said. Melissa's daughter chimed in. "Can I have her scarves? She's not using them." I wrapped my hands around my cup of lukewarm tea. I thought of the leather folder hidden in our bedroom behind the false panel in the closet. Inside was proof of everything they didn't know. I had been quiet for 15 years. I could be loud now. That night, after they'd all gone to their hotel rooms, the house fell silent. I walked to the bedroom Walter and I had shared. Most of my clothes were gone, crammed into boxes labeled donation. On the floor, behind the closet panel, I found the leather folder. The joint trust certificate. My name right beside Walter's. The bank memorandum. The original handwritten draft of the IPO strategy. My handwriting. My idea. I touched the pages the way you touch the cheek of someone you love, knowing they've been kept alive by your hands alone. In the morning, I would call Walter's attorney. "It's time," I would say. And then finally I'd see them look me in the eyes. If you've ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person, you know this is just the beginning. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know. And if you want to hear the rest of this story, the will reading, the truth, and the silence that followed, like this video and subscribe. We've only just begun. Some mornings announce themselves with birdsong, others with rain. That morning announced itself with the sound of cardboard boxes being dragged down the hallway. I was still in bed, if you could call a cot in the laundry nook a bed, staring up at the single bulb swaying slightly from the ceiling. Each time the light moved, the shadows shifted on the walls, turning the mop handles into a row of watchful soldiers. Through the thin wall, I heard Melissa's voice. "This one's donation. That one's keep. No, not that. That's going to the cabin." It was barely 7 a.m. I sat up, the moving blanket sliding from my shoulders, and swung my legs over the edge of the cot. My knees cracked. The floor was cold. I stepped into the hallway. 2 of Walter's grandsons were carrying my cedar chest, the one that had been at the foot of our bed for 30 years. Inside were quilts my mother had sewn, letters Walter had written me when he was courting me, and the sweater I'd worn on our first trip to Asheville. "Careful," I said softly. They didn't stop. One of them glanced back, then looked away quickly, as if eye contact might slow them down. Melissa was in the kitchen, hair pulled into a high ponytail, coffee in hand. She was wearing Walter's college sweatshirt. "We're just doing a little organizing," she said. "Helps to clear the space." "For what?" I asked. She smiled, the kind of smile that felt like it had been trained in front of a mirror. "For the future." I walked to the back porch. The air was cool, still damp from yesterday's rain. The magnolias smelled sweeter in the morning, almost like they were trying to make up for the people inside. I could see Walter's rose bushes along the driveway, unwatered, the petals drooping. He used to tend them every Sunday morning, wearing an old straw hat and humming off-key. Sometimes I'd bring him coffee, and he'd pretend to complain about the interruption just so I'd stay longer. I stayed out there until I heard the front door slam. Car doors, engine noise. They were leaving for brunch. That gave me time. I went upstairs to the bedroom that used to be mine. The closet was half empty, but my secret panel was still there. I pushed it open and pulled out the leather folder. The papers were as I'd left them. The trust certificate with my name in ink as bold as Walter's. The bank memorandum detailing the exact amount I'd invested 15 years ago. And the original IPO strategy. Handwritten, annotated, dated. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the strategy pages. My handwriting was neat, but firm, the way it always was when I knew I'd be judged by it. I remembered the night I'd written it. Walter had been pacing in the den, muttering to himself. His board had rejected his proposals 3 times. The market was shifting, and the company was on the verge of being bought out by a competitor that would gut it. "Maybe it's over," he'd said, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. "Maybe I'm just done." "You're not done," I told him. "You're just cornered." After he went to bed, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. I outlined a multi-phase expansion strategy that leveraged emerging supply chain tech, restructured the sales force, and targeted untapped regional markets. I'd worked in corporate strategy once, long before marriage had rewritten my resume as simply wife. By dawn, my fingers were ink-stained and my back ached. I signed the document with a pseudonym, L. Hartwell. It felt safer that way. 2 days later, Walter came home holding the proposal in one hand. "Someone sent this to the office anonymously," he said. "It's brilliant. Even the handwriting looks like yours." I stirred my tea and said nothing. That plan brought in $42 million in new investments. Walter's name was on the plaque in the lobby. Mine wasn't anywhere. The folder in my lap felt heavier than it should. It was proof, but it was also history. My history. The part they'd all erased because I'd let them. I slid the papers back into the folder and carried it to the kitchen. On the fridge was a calendar with will reading, 3 p.m. circled in red on Friday. That gave me 4 days. When they came back from brunch, the house was noisier. More boxes, more sticky notes. Greg passed me in the hallway carrying Walter's fishing rods. "You're not going to use these," he said without slowing. Melissa's daughter stopped by the laundry nook holding up one of my silk scarves. "Vintage?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She twirled it around her neck. "Looks better on me." I thought about telling her that I'd worn that scarf to Walter's first shareholders meeting, the day he'd been officially named CEO. That I'd stood in the back of the room wearing it like armor, even though no one in that room knew my name. But I didn't. That evening, when the house was quiet again, I walked to the payphone by the pharmacy. They'd cut off my cell service. "Billing confusion," Melissa said. But I still knew the number to Walter's attorney by heart. When he answered, I said only, "It's time." He didn't ask what I meant. "Come in tomorrow," he replied. The next morning, I took the folder to his office downtown. Mr. Brooks was older than Walter had been, with a silver watch that looked like it belonged to another century. He greeted me with the kind of respect that feels foreign after weeks of being spoken to like furniture. I laid out the documents one by one. The trust certificate, the bank memorandum, the IPO strategy. "You wrote this?" he asked, tapping the handwritten pages. "I did," I said. He studied my face for a long moment before speaking again. "And you have proof you authored it?" I nodded. "I have the original drafts, my handwriting. Ink analysis would confirm the age." He smiled faintly. "Then we have something to discuss." When I left his office, the air outside felt different, lighter. At home, the family was in the living room arguing over whether the convertible should be sold or kept. Melissa spotted me in the doorway and said, "We're just figuring out what to do with everything. You know, before the will." I smiled. "I know exactly what to do," I said. "Some countdowns you mark with anticipation, others with dread. I marked mine with tally lines on the inside of my palm, one for each day until the will reading. By Tuesday morning, there were 3 lines. The house woke before I did. The sound of a vacuum roaring down the hallway, and the clatter of someone dumping drawers onto the floor. I'd gotten used to the noises, the steady shuffle of feet, the rustle of packing paper, the sharp rip of tape sealing boxes. But what I hadn't gotten used to was the laughter. That morning, the laughter was Melissa's. She was in the formal parlor with Greg, standing in front of the grand piano Walter had bought me on our 10th anniversary. "You never even play it," she said, running her fingers along the keys. "I play enough," I answered from the doorway. Melissa looked up, surprised. "Oh, didn't see you there." She tapped the piano lid. "We're thinking this would be a great statement piece for my foyer. Or maybe we'll just sell it. These things go for a lot if you find the right buyer." She reached for the lid. My hand got there first. I closed it gently, not breaking eye contact. "That one's not for sale," I said. Greg chuckled, like I'd just told a child's bedtime story. "Everything's for sale, Ellen. You just have to name the price." I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Some things don't have a price." I walked away before they could respond, back to the laundry nook. The cot sagged under me as I sat down, but I didn't mind. A sagging cot was better than the hollow ache in my chest when they spoke about Walter's things like inventory. From the kitchen came the sharp pop of a champagne cork. It wasn't even noon. They weren't here to mourn. They were here to inherit. After lunch, I called Mr. Brooks from the payphone again. "They're circling like vultures," I told him. "Let them circle," he said calmly. "The more they underestimate you, the better." His voice steadied me. There was something comforting about being the only one in the room who knew what was coming. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the back porch, listening to the crickets and the faint hum of traffic from the highway. The moonlight lit up the overgrown rose bushes along the driveway. I imagined Walter out there, kneeling by the soil, brushing dirt from his hands and smiling up at me. My mind wandered back to the early days of our marriage, before the business had grown, before the children had decided I was just the second wife. We'd been living in a 2-bedroom bungalow then, Walter working 16-hour days trying to keep his company afloat. I handled the books at night, quietly correcting numbers he'd gotten wrong in his exhaustion. One night, he'd fallen asleep at his desk, head resting on a stack of unpaid invoices. I covered him with a blanket and stayed up balancing the accounts until dawn. I never told him that my adjustments, my small, careful changes, kept the lights on that month. It wasn't about credit then. It was about survival. But now, as I sat on that porch with my knees aching and my back stiff, I realized that credit was all I had left to take back. Wednesday morning, Melissa called a family meeting in the living room. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, like some kind of intervention. I took my usual folding chair at the edge of the group. "We've been talking," Melissa began, "and it's clear the upkeep on this house is too much for one person." "One person who's still alive," Greg added, smirking. Melissa continued, ignoring him. "We think it's best to list the house as soon as possible. Market's good. We'd all benefit. I'm not selling, I said. Her smile tightened. We understand it's sentimental, but sentiment doesn't pay for roofing or lawn care. Once the will is read, we'll have clarity, and you can make a decision then. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Greg leaned forward. You know Dad wanted us to have a fresh start, and honestly, you'd be happier in a smaller place. Less to manage. Maybe, I said. But this is still my place to manage. They exchanged glances, the kind people share when they think you're too stubborn to know what's good for you. After the meeting, I went upstairs again. The leather folder was still in its place, but now I moved it into my handbag. I wasn't taking chances. On my way back down, I passed the photo wall in the hallway. Walter's picture from the groundbreaking of the new headquarters was there, his smile wide, his arm around me. Someone had written on the bottom of the frame in marker, "Legacy built alone." I stood there for a long time, running my finger over the words. That afternoon, I visited Mr. Brooks again. He'd arranged for a handwriting analyst from Atlanta to review the IPO drafts. We sat together for 2 hours as the analyst examined loops, curves, ink pressure, and paper age. She spoke in a language of measurements and comparisons, finally looking up with a faint smile. "It's hers," she said to Mr. Brooks. "No doubt about it." Mr. Brooks nodded, sliding a document across the desk toward me. "Once this is filed, the patent royalties revert to you. They can't touch them." "How much?" I asked. He leaned back. "Enough that you'll never have to listen to their opinions again." I left the office lighter than I'd felt in weeks. Back at the house, Melissa was in the kitchen pouring wine. "We're having a little gathering Friday night," she said. "You should rest. It's going to be a big weekend with the will and all." I set my handbag on the counter. "Oh, I'll be there," I said. Wouldn't miss it. That night, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table long after the rest of the house was dark. The folder sat in front of me, its leather worn smooth by years of being hidden. I ran my fingers over the cover, thinking about the weight of 15 years' worth of silence. 3 days. That was all. 3 days, and I'd have my voice back. Some clocks tick softly. Others seem to pound out each second like a drumbeat. By Thursday morning, that drumbeat was in my bones. 2 days left. The house was quieter than usual when I woke. No clatter of boxes, no vacuum roaring down the hallway. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of floorboards overhead. I stayed in bed, the cot, really, for a while, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. They looked like continents drifting apart. When I finally got up, I found Melissa in the dining room, arranging silverware on the cherrywood table Walter had chosen himself. The sticky note that had been on it 2 days ago was gone. "You're up early," I said. She didn't look up. "We're having guests tonight, old friends of Dad's. We want to honor him before... everything changes. Everything changes." I ran my hand along the back of one of the chairs. "Sounds lovely." "It will be," she said, smiling that tight smile. "You can join us for dessert." In the afternoon, Greg was in the garage pulling boxes off shelves. "Found some old files," he said when I stepped in. "Dad's business stuff. We'll sort it out." I saw the label on the top box. Contracts. IPO. For a moment, my pulse picked up. He sliced the tape open with a pocket knife and flipped through the folders without any real interest. "Just boring old papers. We'll probably toss most of this." He set the box aside, turning to another. I picked up the IPO folder and casually tucked it under my arm. "Mind if I keep this? For the memories. Suit yourself," he said, already distracted. That night, their guests arrived. Laughter filled the dining room, spilling into the hallway. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes that didn't need washing, letting their voices flow over me like static. One of the guests, a man with a booming voice, was telling a story about Walter. He could charm the stripes off a tiger, that one. Built that company from nothing. Melissa chimed in. Exactly. Dad was the brains, the backbone, the heart. The rest of us just benefited from his brilliance. I dried my hands on a towel and stepped into the doorway. Some of us contributed too, I said. The conversation faltered. Melissa smiled thinly. Of course, you were there for him. That's important. There for him. Like a potted plant is there for a window. I excused myself and went to the laundry nook. The folder was in my bag, along with the IPO file I'd taken from the garage. Between them was enough to rewrite the ending they thought they knew. Friday morning, Will Day, dawned clear and bright. I woke before the sun, the air cooler than it had been all week. The house was silent except for the sound of Melissa's coffee machine sputtering. She was in the kitchen in her robe, hair still damp from the shower. Nervous? I asked. She shrugged. It's just formality. Dad's will was always clear about his intentions. He wanted to take care of us. And me? I asked. Her eyes flicked up to mine, then away. Of course, in his own way. By 9 a.m., they were all in motion. Greg was polishing his shoes in the living room. Melissa was on the phone with someone. I caught the words appraisal and closing date, and the grandkids were taking selfies in front of the house. No one spoke to me except to ask if I knew where the keys to the convertible were. I said I didn't. I did. They were in my handbag. At 11 a.m., I called Mr. Brooks. Everything ready? Everything, he said. You'll want to be here at 2:30. The rest of the morning passed in a strange haze. I walked through the house slowly, room by room. In the parlor, the sunlight caught the dust motes in the air, making them look like gold flecks. I touched the piano lid, remembering the day Walter had surprised me with it. I was 39, convinced I'd never have a space or time to play again. He'd set it up in the corner, a bow tied to the bench. In the study, I ran my hand over the bookshelf we'd built together. Half the books were gone now, packed away without thought. Upstairs in our bedroom, the space felt hollow. My dresser was empty except for one drawer, the bottom one, where Walter had kept a small wooden box. Inside was his watch, the one his father had given him on his wedding day. Underneath it was an envelope with my name in his handwriting. I didn't open it. Not yet. At lunch, Melissa announced that we should all leave early to beat traffic to the lawyer's office. I changed into a navy dress Walter had always liked, simple but tailored. I pinned my hair up and put on a pair of pearl earrings. Not the ones I'd sold long ago, but a small pair Walter had bought me on a whim one spring afternoon. When we gathered by the front door, Melissa looked me over and said, "You clean up nice." I smiled. So do you. We drove in separate cars. I sat in the back seat of Greg's SUV, the folder on my lap like a quiet companion. The streets of Savannah passed by. The moss-covered oaks, the cobblestone squares, the rows of old brick buildings. Walter had loved this city. I wondered what he'd think if he knew what was about to happen in one of its quietest law offices. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, my heartbeat was steady. 2 days ago, I'd been invisible. Today, they were about to see me. Some rooms feel cold because of the air, others because of the people in them. Mr. Brooks's conference room was both. We arrived in 2s and 3s, the click of polished shoes echoing off glass walls and leather trim. Outside, the sky had turned a flat, indifferent gray, the kind Savannah gets before a storm. Melissa swept in first, wearing a silk blouse the color of champagne. Tom right behind her. Greg followed, fiddling with his phone, and the grandchildren trailed after like shadows with earbuds. I was last. Mr. Brooks greeted each of us, his handshake firm but brief, then gestured toward the long mahogany table. Name cards were placed at each seat. Mine was at the far end, a folding chair, of course, tucked beneath. I sat without comment, the leather folder resting across my lap. As we settled, Melissa leaned toward Greg. "Smile when they read your name," she whispered. "Dad wanted you to have the convertible." Greg grinned. "And you get the lake house. Don't forget." "I won't," she said. "And she'll get, what, a stipend?" I didn't flinch. Mr. Brooks cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here. Today we will execute the final will and testament of Mr. Walter Hartwell, dated 6 months prior to his passing." The shuffle of papers was the only sound for a moment. "Before we begin," Mr. Brooks continued, "there is an addendum to address." Melissa's brows pinched. "Addendum?" "Yes," he said. "This was recorded on Mr. Hartwell's home security system 3 days after the funeral, in accordance with his wishes to be played here today." He pressed a button on a small silver recorder. Walter's voice filled the room, slower than I remembered, but steady. "If my children or stepchildren speak ill of my wife in my absence, I request a penalty be applied to their inheritance. $1 million per word." The room went still. "Mr. Brooks clicked to the next track. My own hallway's echo came through. Melissa's voice first. "She's still breathing? Thought she'd be gone by now." Greg's voice followed. "She built soup. He built an empire." Melissa again. "Let her rot with her memories." They didn't need to play the rest. Mr. Brooks read from a transcript. "In total, verified statements amount to 86 words deemed derogatory under the clause. This results in an $86 million deduction." Greg's chair scraped back. "That's ridiculous." Melissa's cheeks flushed. "Dad wouldn't have recorded you?" Mr. Brooks interrupted. "He did. He also had the clause notarized." The room shifted then. The grandchildren frowning at their parents, Tom leaning forward with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And what does that leave us with?" Melissa demanded. Mr. Brooks looked down at his papers. "Your respective shares are reduced to a combined total of $4 million, split evenly." Greg swore under his breath. Melissa turned to me, her smile gone entirely. "You set this up?" I met her eyes. "No, Walter did." Mr. Brooks continued, unbothered by the tension. "As for the primary beneficiary of the trust, the remaining estate assets, and any associated intellectual property?" Melissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Mr. Hartwell named his wife, Ellen Hartwell." The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I kept my hand still on the folder, the paper inside warm from my palms. "That can't be right," Greg said finally. "The company, the properties, the patents, they're his, ours." Mr. Brooks adjusted his glasses. "There is a separate matter to address regarding intellectual property. We'll come to that in a moment." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "What property?" Mr. Brooks ignored the question and slid a heavy envelope down the table toward me. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is for you." I didn't open it. Not yet. The weight of it was enough. Melissa leaned back, crossing her arms. "So you get everything and we get scraps? After all we did for him?" I looked at her for a long moment. "All you did?" I said softly. "Funny, I have a different memory." Greg's jaw tightened. "This isn't over." "No," I said. It isn't. Mr. Brooks tapped the table gently. We will take a brief recess before proceeding with the intellectual property matter. As chairs scraped back and murmurs filled the room, I stayed seated. The envelope was still in front of me, unopened. My fingers traced the edges slowly, savoring the moment. 2 reveals in one day would be too much for them. Better to let them stew on the first. The second, the one that proved I'd been more than Walter's wife, would come after the break. And when it did, nothing in their lives would ever look the same again. Some silences are polite, others are heavy enough to bend the air. When Mr. Brooks called the room back to order after the recess, the air in that conference room was bending. Melissa sat stiff-backed, her lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. Greg was pacing near the window, his reflection warped in the rain-speckled glass. The grandchildren were hunched over their phones, thumbs moving fast, but eyes flicking up every few seconds. I was still in my folding chair, the envelope in front of me. I hadn't moved it. The weight of their stares was almost as heavy as the paper inside. Mr. Brooks cleared his throat. Before we conclude, there is one final matter. This pertains to an intellectual property asset not previously disclosed to the family. Melissa's head snapped up. Asset? What asset? 15 years ago, Mr. Brooks began. Shortly before Hartwell Industries avoided bankruptcy through a strategic IPO, an anonymous proposal was submitted to the board. The model became the blueprint for the public offering, and was later the basis for what is now known as the Hartwell Stabilization Model. That was Dad's plan. Greg interrupted. Everyone knows that. Mr. Brooks didn't look at him. At the time, the author of the proposal was listed as L. Hartwell, presumed to be a consulting firm. But recent forensic analysis, including ink composition, postal records, and handwriting comparison, confirms that the proposal was authored entirely by Ellen Hartwell. The room went still again. Melissa laughed, a short, sharp sound. She doesn't even have a degree in business. I looked at her calmly. I had one before you were born. Greg shook his head. You're saying she wrote the IPO plan? No. Dad wouldn't have presented her work as his own. Mr. Brooks supplied smoothly. He did. In his own words, he asked her to let him take the credit because, quote, the board would never follow a woman. The attorney picked up a sheet of paper from his folder. This is a notarized letter from Mr. Hartwell, confirming that fact. He began to read. She found the cure before the world knew it was sick. She kept quiet because she loved me. I asked her to hide her light so mine could shine. I always knew I was standing on her shoulders. I could feel their eyes on me, searching for any sign of embarrassment. There was none. Mr. Brooks went on. The patent for the Hartwell Stabilization Model was never formally transferred to Hartwell Industries. It remained in Mrs. Hartwell's name, generating annual residuals of $9.4 million through multiple licensing streams. Melissa's wine-colored nails drummed against the table. That money belongs to the company. Mr. Brooks shook his head. Legally, it belongs to the inventor, which is your stepmother. I reached for the envelope and finally broke the seal. Inside was the patent certificate, framed in cream cardstock, my name printed clean and unmistakable at the top. Ellen M. Hartwell, sole inventor. Beneath it was a ledger listing every quarterly payout since its inception, all deposited into a holding trust Walter had set up in my name. Untouched, waiting. Greg dropped into his chair, staring at the table. Melissa just sat there, her eyes narrowing as if she could will the page to say something else. You were living off my mind all along, I said quietly. No one answered. Mr. Brooks slid a smaller envelope toward me. Per Walter's instructions, these are the deeds, accounts, and full transfer documents for the trust, the patent, and all related assets. I slipped them into my handbag. Thank you. Melissa finally spoke, her voice thin. So you're taking everything? I looked at her, steady. No, I'm taking back what was already mine. The rest of the reading went quickly. They had nothing left to contest, no clauses they could twist. The law was the law, and Walter had been meticulous. When it was done, Mr. Brooks rose and shook my hand. Congratulations, Mrs. Hartwell. I stood, smoothing the skirt of my dress. Melissa didn't look at me. Greg didn't either. But the grandchildren, one of them, the youngest, met my gaze for just a second before glancing away. There was something there. Not warmth, not yet, but maybe the beginning of understanding. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, a streak of sunlight cutting across the wet pavement. I stepped toward the car without waiting for anyone else. The leather folder was still in my bag, but now it was lighter. It had done its job. I thought of Walter then, of the night he'd asked me to hide my work, of the decades I'd spent letting my name fade into the wallpaper. I thought of all the times I'd told myself it didn't matter. It mattered. And now, the world, or at least this family, knew it. By the time we reached the house, Melissa had gone silent. Greg disappeared into the study. The grandchildren scattered upstairs. I walked into the kitchen, set my bag on the counter, and poured myself a glass of water. For the first time in weeks, I drank it in peace. Tomorrow, the packing would begin. But tonight, the house was mine again. They had 48 hours to vacate. Mr. Brooks had been clear. Walter's will included an occupancy clause for non-resident heirs. All personal belongings had to be removed within 2 days of the reading. No extensions. No exceptions. The letter sat on the kitchen counter that evening, signed by the executor, notarized by the court. The paper itself looked harmless, but it might as well have been a starting pistol. By morning, the packing had begun. Melissa's voice was sharper now, her usual polished calm stripped away. Where's the bubble wrap? I told you we'd need more boxes. Greg stomped past the laundry nook carrying a stack of his father's suits. These are mine, he muttered. The grandchildren moved quickly, sweeping jewelry into velvet cases, stacking photo frames into bins. Their laughter was gone. They didn't even turn the music on this time. I didn't join them. Instead, I made coffee in Walter's old French press, the one Melissa had once called outdated, and walked the halls slowly, cup in hand, as if reacquainting myself with a house I'd been visiting only in dreams. The first sticker I saw was on the antique dresser in the upstairs guest room. Bright yellow. Mine. I peeled it off carefully, folded it once, and dropped it into my pocket. In the hallway, a blue sticker clung to the armchair Walter used to read in. Into the pocket it went. By the time I reached the master bedroom, my pocket was full of their little flags of conquest. At the end of the hall, I found the green sticker they'd put on the silver frame of our wedding photo. That one I didn't fold. I tore it down the middle before dropping it into the trash. Downstairs, Greg was in the parlor, wrapping the lamp Walter had bought in New Orleans. Careful, I said as I passed. He didn't look up. It's coming with me. No, I said simply. His head jerked up. Excuse me? That was a gift Walter gave me. It stays here. He opened his mouth to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. His jaw worked silently before he turned back to his packing. By noon, Melissa had corralled her kids into the garage to sort boxes. I could hear her voice drifting through the open door. She's heartless, she said. I stepped outside. No, I corrected. I gave you a house, You gave me hell." Her face froze, color rising in her cheeks. The grandchildren avoided my eyes. That afternoon, I walked through the dining room where the grand piano sat untouched. They'd tagged it too, a small pink sticker on the bench. I peeled it off and placed it on the table in front of Melissa. "This was always mine," I said. She didn't reply. By evening, the house felt different. The air was lighter, the spaces less crowded. I could hear the clock in the foyer ticking, something I hadn't noticed in weeks. In the kitchen, I found Walter's watch sitting on the counter. Greg must have left it there by mistake. I picked it up, running my thumb over the worn leather strap. The watch face still bore a faint scratch from the time Walter dropped it on our honeymoon, laughing that perfection was overrated. I slipped it onto my wrist. It fit as if it had been waiting for me all along. That night, I sat on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The rose bushes were still there, though neglected, their petals curling at the edges. Beyond them stood the old pomegranate tree Walter had planted before we were married. At its base, I saw it, the tiny rose bush I'd planted when Greg turned 5. One brittle stem, leaves shriveled but still clinging. I went to the shed, found the rusted watering can, and filled it from the outdoor spigot. The water poured slowly, darkening the soil, releasing that sharp, earthy smell of something waking up. "We bloom again," I whispered. By Friday afternoon, the last car pulled out of the driveway. Melissa didn't say goodbye. Greg didn't either. The grandchildren glanced back only once before turning their eyes forward. The house was mine again. Not the version they'd tried to strip bare, but the one with memory in every corner. Even the quiet ones. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the doorknobs Walter had polished every spring. In the dining room, I ran my fingers over the cherry wood table, now free of champagne rings and careless elbows. In the study, I opened the drawer where Walter kept his pen collection. I found the one he'd used to sign our marriage certificate. The ink was dry, but I kept it. Upstairs, I opened the envelope Walter had left me. Inside was a short letter in his handwriting. "I'm sorry for the years I let your light stay hidden. I always knew you were the better half of this legacy. Now the world will know it too." I sat on the bed for a long time, the letter in my hands. When I finally got up, I took the bundle of crumpled stickers from my pocket and threw them into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened, the words mine disappearing in the flames. They never were. The silence on that first morning was almost startling. No footsteps pounding overhead, no drawers slamming, no hushed voices dripping with impatience. Just the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant hum of cicadas in the garden. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching sunlight creep across the driveway. The rose bushes were catching the light just right, their bruised petals glowing in shades of pink and gold. Walter would have liked that. For the first time in weeks, I took my breakfast at the cherry wood dining table. No folding chair, no paper plate. I set out the china and silver, because why not? Halfway through my toast, I realized I was smiling. The next week, I moved through the house at my own pace. I dusted the piano, not because anyone was coming over to see it, but because I wanted to. I opened the windows in the study and let the breeze carry the smell of rain-soaked earth inside. In the bedroom, I took down the Legacy Built Alone frame from the hallway. The glass was smudged from fingers that had no right to touch it. I replaced the print with a photograph of the first product Hartwell Industries had ever sold. A simple, unremarkable item, the kind of thing no one looks twice at. But I remembered how proud Walter had been, holding it like a newborn. I remembered, too, that I had been the one to suggest the design change that made it profitable. One evening, while sorting through the cedar chest, I came across a small sealed envelope in Walter's handwriting. "For when you decide to start over, Inside was a check, a substantial one, and a note. The patent is yours. The trust is yours. But I know you, Ellen. You'll make something new. This is just to help you begin. I sat there with the envelope in my lap for a long time, listening to the rain against the window. By the second week, the stillness of the house had shifted. It no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a museum. Every creak of the floorboards, every familiar shadow, reminded me of the noise that had filled these rooms. Not just from the last few weeks, but from all the years before. Some spaces collect too much history. This one had collected enough. I called Mr. Brooks the next morning. "List it," I said. His pause was brief. "Are you sure?" "Yes, it's time." The process moved quickly. The house was valuable. Prime location, expansive grounds, historic architecture. By the end of the month, it had a buyer. A quiet couple from Charleston who wanted a weekend retreat. I met them only once, long enough to know they would treat the place gently. That was enough for me. On the final night before the closing, I walked through each room one last time. In the parlor, I played a single note on the piano. It rang through the air like a farewell. In the study, I closed the window and ran my fingers over the desk Walter had used to sign contracts and write speeches. In the bedroom, I placed Walter's watch back in the wooden box, next to the letter he'd left me. I would keep the letter. The watch could stay with the house, a small piece of him left behind. The movers came the next morning. My things fit into far fewer boxes than theirs ever had. By noon, the truck was loaded. I locked the front door, slid the key into an envelope for the new owners, and left it on the mantel. When I stepped onto the porch, the wind caught the hem of my coat, and for the first time in months, I felt light. My new home was in Santa Barbara, a small penthouse with wide windows, white curtains, and the sound of the Pacific at night. The first evening there, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and watched the sun drop into the ocean. No footsteps overhead, no whispers in the hallway, just waves. With the royalties from the patent, I started something I'd been thinking about for a long time. Not a business exactly, not a charity either. A fund, a quiet one. No ribbon cuttings, no galas. Its name was long, almost too long for the paperwork. The Foundation for Women Who Were Erased. We would give scholarships, small business grants, and, most importantly, recognition to women who had built quietly while someone else took the credit. I knew what that felt like. I knew what it cost. I hung a wooden sign beside my front door. It was carved from a piece of the old oak tree Walter and I had planted in Savannah. The sign read, "This home was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence." The mailman chuckled every time he saw it. One afternoon, while pinning a stack of letters for the foundation, I found something tucked between the envelopes. It was a drawing in crayon on yellow paper, greased from years of being folded. A stick figure of me, big glasses, standing next to a giant light bulb. In purple scribble it said, "To Grandma. You think better than Google." It was from my youngest grandchild, years before they'd learned to roll their eyes at me. I smoothed it out and pinned it to the fridge. Some things, I decided, were worth keeping. Santa Barbara was as close to clean as I'd felt in years. Morning started with the sound of gulls instead of slamming doors, the smell of salt air instead of stale perfume. The ocean was my new clock. High tide over breakfast, low tide by the time the mail arrived. The foundation work fit me the way an old favorite sweater does, quietly, without needing to announce itself. I kept the office small. 2 rooms over a bakery on State Street, the scent of fresh bread drifting up the stairwell. The walls were lined with photographs of women we'd funded. A beekeeper in Oregon, a machinist in Detroit, a single mother running a boat repair shop in Louisiana. Every face was a reminder that what had happened to me wasn't rare. Erasure had 1,000 disguises, and most of them smiled while they did it. 3 months after I moved in, an envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Me, sitting on the savannah porch last summer, watering the tiny rose bush at the base of the pomegranate tree. On the back, in handwriting I recognized as my youngest granddaughter's, it said, "I didn't understand. I'm sorry." The words were small, cramped, but they hit me harder than any insult I'd ever overheard in that house. I set the photo on my desk and stared at it for a long time. The rose bush in the picture was still thin, but the leaves were greener than I remembered. I considered writing back. I even took out a pen, but I stopped. Some apologies need time to ripen before they're picked. That night, I walked the shoreline until the water chilled my toes. The sky was turning that bruised purple you only get just before night fully falls. Walter used to say dusk was the most honest time of day. Nothing's hiding, but nothing's pretending to be more than it is. I wondered what he'd say now, seeing me here, running a foundation under my own name. I wondered if he'd think the cost had been worth it. I knew my answer. By spring, the foundation had tripled its grant output. Word had spread, mostly through the women we'd helped, telling others like them. We started getting letters from across the country. Some were straightforward requests for funding. Others were confessions written in careful, nervous handwriting. I designed the whole project, but they gave the award to my manager. I started the company, but my name's not even on the documents. I wrote the speech, but he's the one they applauded. I kept every letter. One afternoon, while sorting through applications, my assistant brought in a package. No return label, just my name handwritten across the top. Inside was a small box wrapped in tissue. Beneath the paper was a brass compass, the kind you'd take on a ship. On the inside of the lid, someone had engraved, "You found the map. Thank you for showing me the way." No signature. I held it in my hands for a long time, feeling the weight of it. That evening, I placed the compass next to the photograph from my granddaughter on the mantel in my living room. Together, they looked like parts of a story still being written, but not every reminder was gentle. One night in early summer, I was invited to a business gala in Los Angeles. They wanted to give the foundation a Community Impact Award. The ballroom was all crystal chandeliers, and the clink of glasses. When I stepped up to the podium, I scanned the room and froze for a moment. Greg was there. He was older, leaner, his hair thinner at the temples. He stood at the back near the exit, a glass of water in his hand. I didn't break stride in my speech, but my heart ticked faster. When it was over, he didn't come forward. He just nodded once and slipped out before the applause had stopped. I never saw him that night, but the next morning an email arrived in the foundation inbox. No greeting, no name, just 2 lines. "You were right. We didn't see you. I'm sorry. It didn't feel like a truce. Not yet. But it felt like something cracking, a space where light might get in." That week, I went back to Savannah for the first time since selling the house. The couple who'd bought it had kept the gardens alive. The roses were blooming. The pomegranate tree was heavy with fruit. And at the base, the tiny rose bush had 3 full blossoms. I knelt down, touched the petals, and felt a kind of closure that no court order or bank transfer could ever give me. Back in Santa Barbara, I added a line to the foundation's mission statement. "We are here to water what others tried to uproot." Because that, I realized, was what I'd been doing all along. It was late autumn in Santa Barbara, the kind of evening where the air holds both the weight of the day and the cool promise of night. I'd just come back from the foundation's year-end dinner, a modest gathering in the bakery's upstairs office. No gala, no cameras, just the quiet hum of people who understood the work without needing it explained. I set my coat on the chair by the balcony and poured myself a glass of water. From my window, the Pacific was silver under the moonlight, the waves folding into each other like pages of an unread book. I thought of Walter then, of the life we'd built, of the ways I'd chosen silence when speaking would have been harder, but perhaps easier in the long run. And I thought of the day in that law office when silence finally broke. The compass sat on the mantel beside the crayon drawing from my grandson and the photograph from my granddaughter. 3 pieces of a puzzle no one else might connect, but I knew exactly how they fit. The compass was for direction. The drawing was for recognition. The photograph was for understanding. Each had come from someone who had, in their own way, overlooked me, and each was now a small piece of acknowledgement. Quiet, but present. One afternoon, as I was closing the office, a young woman came in. She was nervous, clutching a folder the way I'd once clutched my own leather file all those years ago. "I heard you help women who've been left out of the story," she said. I gestured for her to sit. Her story spilled out in pieces. A tech startup, an idea she'd nurtured for years, a male partner who'd pushed her name out of every contract once the investors came in. When she was finished, she looked at me and said, "They think I'll just let it go." I smiled, the kind that isn't about joy so much as recognition. "They all think that," I told her, "until they're wrong." Helping her reminded me why I'd started all this. The money, the recognition, they mattered, but not as much as making sure no one else had to sit in a laundry nook eating cold chicken while their life was divided up in front of them. I couldn't change what had happened to me, but I could change what might happen to someone else. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the balcony doors and let the sea air in. The wind caught the edge of the wooden sign by my front door, the one carved from the oak Walter and I had planted in Savannah, and made it creak softly. This home was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence. I thought of all the noise I'd endured, the snide comments, the laughter, the sticky notes claiming what was never theirs. I thought of the sound of scissors slicing through the tape of boxes as they packed my life away. And then I thought of the sound that had replaced it. Waves, steady and endless, carrying everything old out to sea. If someone asked me now whether it had been worth it, the years of hiding my name, the sacrifices, the fight to get it back, I'd have to answer honestly. It wasn't about worth. It was about truth. Worth is measured in dollars and deeds. Truth is measured in whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and not flinch. And I could. I don't know what the next chapter will be. Maybe the foundation will grow beyond me. Maybe one day I'll walk by the Savannah house again and see a stranger at the window, and I'll smile without needing to knock. What I do know is that I'm no longer a footnote. The night deepened. I sat on the balcony until the moon had shifted high and the air had cooled against my skin. Below, the ocean kept moving, patient and unhurried, as if it knew that everything finds its level eventually. I whispered it then. The whisper that had been building for years, the one I'd held back until there was no one left to talk over it. I was the map. And for the first time, saying it out loud felt less like a confession and more like a beginning.